So I'm going to begin by asking Jürgen Bruns-Bettering, who's head of Hafen City, on behalf of the mayor of Hamburg, to tell us about this fantastic experience. Jürgen, thank you so much for stepping in. You're no stranger to ULI. You were on a panel last year. I'm delighted you're going to tell us about good practice, politics, urban planning, and the rest. Jürgen.
Thank you very much, and I have to apologize myself. The mayor regrets very much that he cannot be personally here. He would be to love in this panel, but also in Paris. He is also the chairman of the French-German Relationship Council of Mrs. Merkel, so he has a specific relationship to Paris and France himself, but he couldn't make it. So let me try to make a few comments with regard to the political and urban development perspective we are talking about when we are talking about density. And I would like, a little bit different than this morning in the starting session, talk about a little bit about trends, not 2-year trends, but in urban development talk about 30-year trends roughly. And I think when we are talking now about the issues to solve, we have to look into politically also into this trend. In a city like Hamburg, but also in Berlin, for example, and Munich, we had within the city boundaries, in spite of the expansion of the core cities in terms of workspaces, significant population growth. There was, so to say, population growth induced, so to say, demand specifically for housing, but naturally also based on the demographics. Lord Rogers said he was talking about renaissance of the city. We talk actually about the inner city, because very much of that process of densification took place in the inner city in terms of spatial terms and in the inner city periphery, those sites which were basically vacated. And in the last 10 years, we have the experience in Hamburg, but also in other German cities which are not shrinking, but the metropolitan cities are actually growing in spite of the national growth trend. We see that this process is not only significant in absolute terms, but also in relative terms. So actually the city cores are growing faster, densifying faster than the periphery. That means a relative loss in terms of the sprawl-related activities. So that's part of the good news. So when we are talking about the long-term trend, that could be accommodated, so to say, by politics rather easy. In Hamburg, it basically means in the last 30 years, there was 200,000 people more to accommodate, and with all the military sites available, railroad sites available, hospital sites, manufacturing sites, outdated harbor facilities. You saw the picture of Hafen City. This was, so to say, an easy political urban management task. We have, though, and that's the second argument, a political shift, at least starting 5, 6, 7 years after the turn of the century in terms of the long-term trend. We had a quite strong imbalance in the market, dramatic growth in prices of housing, and specifically also related to the decline in terms of interest rates, basically a bubble economy based on bricks and mortar. And basically by that forced politics to react very significantly. And Mayor Olaf Scholz was elected in 2011 solving that problem, because the housing problem, as it was said, was the core issue of urban politics. And that basically the electorate forced, so to say, a shift in terms of urban politics. The housing supply was, and that is the promise, basically to be doubled. And a second aspect, housing was not affordable anymore. And since it was not affordable, 1/3, and that was the promise, was supposed to be delivered as affordable housing. So politics had and this was done, for example, in Hamburg and to lesser degrees also in other cities, basically had to change its governance regime because electorate enforced that. Basically, the private industry joined together with the boroughs, with state government, and in Hamburg it was called the Coalition of Housing. A new network and governance structure was established, and it worked. It produced, so to say, a doubling of housing supply and, in consequence, a density increase in the inner city. And why was it possible? It was possible because it was rather low density, just as Berlin is a low density city, so it was politically still easy to do. Secondly, the communication about densification was linked actually to housing demand and satisfying social demand. So the communication issue was not so much primarily on density, but on supplying welfare and housing. Thirdly, it was an important role that actually the actors in the market were available as public housing companies, for example, in Hamburg, which basically owns almost 15% of the housing stock in the city, and another 10% is owned by housing cooperatives. So they were, with their social agenda, in a position to be mobilized, basically, to actively progress. And naturally, the city administration then was refocused. And that was, so to say, a political agenda and an agenda in terms of political management of the city, which basically worked. And that basically was commented by Mayor last year in summer still. That is intelligent densification. We will build more housing, we will build higher housing basically, but we will keep our green in the city, we will develop infrastructure as has been explained, and all those issues related to this. That has changed to a certain degree because we have a structural, so to say, hole which has to be dealt with in urban politics. When we're talking about Hamburg, it's now 80,000 people, refugees, which will move into the city this year and last year. That is, so to say, almost 2% of the population. And it's not, so to say, like tripling the green card applications for moving into the city. So it is a tremendous issue in terms of the stress, in terms of city government, in terms of supplying housing, and developing the integration into the labor market. And the agency responsible for the labor market basically assumes that it takes 10 years to basically integrate 50% of the population moving into the labor market, and only achieving, so to say, half of the population for gainful employment. So when we are talking now about densification of the city in this situation, then it means also tremendously a political shift in terms of interpreting the city. It's not only a housing question, but it becomes, so to say, a social justice question. It becomes a question of integrating the society. Politicians have been discussing not about social justice, for example, on a world scale and international scale. We have been discussing it on a national scale or urban scale. This is a tremendous shift, and the mayor basically yesterday said, we want to be the city of arrivals. That is something which is necessary on the one hand, but I do not know what that means. I cannot answer that question at the present moment, because management means that, and that's what he also said, is we have to go into a far more vertical city that will not look like Barcelona anymore. Hamburg very much looks in some areas like Barcelona. And we have to go to mid-rise buildings and mid-rise towers, which makes important buildings. And we have to go more cities and new places, as the mayor said, so to say, taking major green spaces in the city in order to evolve basically into a reactionary mood which is successful in the limited time available, because we are talking about peak demands which cannot be managed in other ways. And that naturally also means other types of real estate product, but that may be the starting point of the challenge we are talking about when we're talking about densification last year or 20 years ago and today.
Thank you very much. I'd now like to ask Leif Andersson from Sweden to give us his view as an investor and a developer on this very important topic.
Yeah, thank you. I have a background basically very much from Stockholm, and we have, over the last 5 to 10 years, had a great lack of political leadership. And if you look back some 20, 25 years, we had totally the different situation where the politicians invested in infrastructure, they were planning for a growth of the city. And then we had I think also Lord Richard Rogers was talking about Centre Pompidou as a democratic building. And what we have faced are maybe our system being almost too democratic. So in 1991, we had a large infrastructure package which was abandoned due to politics and due to the fact that almost anyone could challenge a large development scheme. So that project was then delayed around 20 years. So where we stand today is that we have the infrastructure which we had for a population which we had in 91. But population growth has been tremendous, and the city of Stockholm is growing by several percent every year. We have 40,000 new inhabitants every year and no new housing. So the supply and demand is just, the gap between them is just widening every year. And in that then, as an investor and a developer, on one hand, you're quite happy to see that demand is rising, supply is short, and you can profit from that. But at the same time, over time, of course, you'd like to see the city to grow in a sensible way. And unfortunately, the politicians seems not to have been listening to the previous speaker. Because I think the overall plan, which we are working along, is quite well done, the sort of the master plan for Stockholm. But when it comes to implementation, and also when you look at how important it is to protect culturally classified buildings and the conflict between a lot of sort of the beauty of Stockholm and the need for higher density, you always are in a very, very tricky position vis-a-vis the politicians. And I would say that that's an area where we definitely lack political leadership. No one is really able to take some of these more, say, difficult decisions. And then again, I think it's sort of very much a Swedish issue that we are very careful to see to that those who already have something, they should keep it, and very reluctant to give to others. We have very high minimum wages, so it's very difficult for those who do not have a job to get the job. Same thing, a rent-regulated market means that those who have an apartment are super happy because they don't pay any rents, but it's almost impossible to get into the market. And if we cannot address these issues, I think our problems will just continue. And also, given what's happening right now, we had 190,000 asylum seekers and refugees coming to Sweden last year. And the fourth biggest city in Sweden have 108 inhabitants. Unfortunately, that city was not empty, so we have to solve it in a different way. And I think if you compare the way we integrate to some other countries in Europe, I think that the average time for an immigrant to find a job in the UK is 7 months. And in Sweden, it's 7 years. And I think that is probably the greatest challenge we have, given that we have recently closed our borders, but we have had them very, very open for a very long time. And with 190,000 new immigrants and possibly new Swedes, and also this trend is just continuing. 2016 will probably be the same. If we cannot find a way to integrate, I think we will be in even greater problems than we are in today.
Thank you. There is a great theme about political leadership and lacking political leadership leading to great social inequality, which is going to cause enormous problems for our cities. So it's not just about the buildings, it's also about how we create the cities and how we plan them. So I would now like to get a French view from Hugues Parent, who's head of La Défense, and who is also grappling with issues of density in the La Défense region.
Yes, thank you. I'm the only French of the panel, so you will notice it by my accent. Well, La Défense has a typically French history, but it's also facing a worldwide competition among the business districts around the world. So we are coping with this history and also with this competition. As long as you talk about density, especially in Asia, in the Mediterranean basin, or in some places elsewhere, density has been mostly created by history, which means when you have a business district inside a site, a city, which has been created by history, you can follow the flows and the movements of the society. You can answer the needs of the people and the generation coming because you are inside a lively body. But there is a second way of creating density. It's by choice. It's mostly by political choice. And that has been the situation for cities like Brasilia, but it's also the situation from some housing cities around the main capitals in Europe and in the world. It has also been the case for some places like Canary Wharf, for example, on the London Docklands, or La Défense. But there is a specificity in La Défense. This choice has been, that's why it's a French story. This choice has been done first of all because we couldn't create inside Paris, like in every major city in the world, we couldn't create a downtown, a business downtown inside Paris. It's still the case. If you follow the stories of some high-rise buildings in Paris, you'll be amazed. So it's still the case. The government at that time, and that's also typically French, I mean, it came from the government. The government, in this industrial development period, the 50s, beginning of the 60s, had the feeling that we had to do something to gather headquarters, workforces, white-collar forces, of course, but we couldn't do it inside Paris. So push it on the side, and specifically on the west side. So that was the reason and the origin of the creation of La Défense. Within the last 60 years, we create one of the most important business districts in Europe outside of the downtown, the centers of the cities. So we have now 35 million square feet located in La Défense. And the problem for us is, as in every density created by choice, like a city like Brasilia or a business district like La Défense, how to bring life in it. And that's the key point because it's related to the study ULI led this year. The question is not to build density or to choose to have a density somewhere. The question is, what is a good, what is a bad density, and how can you progress to the good to the positive density? And it's especially the case when you are in a worldwide competition, because you are competing against those business districts that has been created 20 years ago, and they already included everything that was modernity in society. You have included everything that were the will of the new generation coming, working, and mostly very acknowledged, mostly very internationally oriented, and so they have the choice. So you are facing something that the cities like Brasilia are not facing. We are facing a competition. So for us, it's critical to make this business district to keep it on track. In Paris, we are mostly very conservative. That's the reason why we have no downtown, and that's the reason why, after 60 years, everybody considered that La Défense was there. It was almost heritage. So everything was perfect. I mean, we had something like 200,000 people commuting every day, 83% by public transportation. So everything was done. There was nothing more to do. One question: where's the life? How is it? How can we keep it attractive for the next 10 years? And that was a key point. I took my office 3 years ago, but reflections were already ongoing. There was no strategic plan within the last 60 years for La Défense. Nobody cared about what will happen in the next 10 years. There was absolutely no benchmark between the different competitors we had, beginning with Canary Wharf, but also Gangnam in Seoul, because the investors can choose and pick what they want and where they believe people will be attracted to. So we had to do that in the last 3 years, and now we know exactly where we go. First of all, we have to act on what we can do, really. Otherwise, you have to act on conditions to create life, but we can already do something by political and financial decisions. First of all, to bring more public transportation. Secondly, to implement a lot of sustainable development regulation, especially to reduce the carbon footprint. Third, you can implement some conditions to bring life through mostly retail and housing. You can decide it. But after that, you have to be confident in the life you are creating to attract new people, new business, new kind of companies that are the lack of La Défense right now. We gather half of the big French and some international companies, but we have a lack of small business which are creating life. So for that reason, we just consider with pragmatism what we are. We have a 60-year project. We cannot build what has been built in Canary Wharf within the last 10 years, or even what has been built, project you know, in the city of London, where you transferred or you transform a business hub in a social hub. It's very difficult to do in La Défense, first of all, because everything is already done on a business purpose. Mostly the towers are inhabited by companies, and there is no housing there. And secondly, because of our heritage, Paris heritage, we have to keep this perspective going from the Louvre to the Big Arch. You cannot build in the middle of La Défense new facilities for welcoming housing or entertainment. So we decided, and that's a very, very specific case, and maybe it could be an example, maybe a failure in the next 5 years. But we decided to build most of the things that we felt was a lack in La Défense behind it. So the huge effort is now, the tremendous effort is going behind the arch. And as my intention was, and that's the way I sold it, the project. The arch was at the end of the project. We will put it at the middle of the project. And so if you go now, you climb on the big arch, and you look what happens behind it, you will see the biggest arena, covered arena in Europe in construction. It will be open in the next of this year. You will see a circulation, pedestrian circulation, and a bike circulation between the arch and this arena. You will see, will be open at the end of this year. You will see the area where we will build, like in Canary Wharf, because they are doing that now, 500,000 housing, 500 meters back from the arch. You will see the works ongoing works for the new railway station, as efficient as the one you have below the arch. You will see all that, and that's a way we're renewing the concept of positive density in La Défense, and it's maybe a solution that might inspire some others. When you cannot build in it, positive density could come from outside of the neighborhood you are just coping with.
Thank you. That's an excellent contribution, reminding us that density is equally important in commercial districts as it is in residential districts, because the two together go up to make the whole city. And the idea of adding on to is another way of creating density, but also creating life. And I well remember the arguments we had in the City of London with owners who did not want street life and who did not want retail on the ground floor, which of course creates ghastly ghettos because people don't want to walk down those streets. Luckily, I think times have moved on, and your solution is a very imaginative one. So finally we come to Greg, who is going to tell us about ULI and what it's doing, but also give us his views on density.
Judith, thank you very much. I chose just a small number of slides to illustrate the things that we wanted to say. So we promised you last year that we would engage in an investigation about density. Lisette set out what she wanted us to do. We published 2 reports in the last 7 months. Those reports are the product of a huge survey of ULI members. 300 of you participated. Thank you for that. Workshops in Istanbul, Dresden, Berlin, Warsaw, Birmingham, Stockholm, London. Thank you to the people who hosted those workshops. An advisory group that included Rosemary Feenan and Michael Spies and Andy Martin and Brian Moran and many other people. Thank you for all the help there. And what we've done is 2 reports, a big literature review, 12 small case studies, 6 really detailed case studies, and a big survey. And all of it's on the ULI Europe website, and it's all available there to have a look at. And what we've really learned from this is Richard Rogers and I obviously had the same dream last night because Richard said very clearly about the correlation between density and environmental performance, and I'm very grateful that he did that, because when we reviewed the literature from the World Bank, the UN, the OECD, and all of the other global organizations, this relationship between environmental performance and density is absolutely underlined in the way that Richard said. But what I think surprised us was the relationship between density and economic performance. Ug has made a wonderful case about the relationship between density and competitiveness. But let's also remember the relationship between density and innovation, density and proximity, density and interaction, density and digitization, density and the shared city. And so this relationship between economic performance of cities and density came through very clearly in our case studies, as did a point that Richard made about the troubling concerns about ghettoization, the relationship between sprawl and the spatialization of income distribution, if we can use that language. In other words, there's a relationship between density and social and economic cohesion that's now become very important and very clear. So, except in a very, very few cases where there's a particular kind of industrial structure or a particularly inherited geography, density is basically good for the environment, good for the economy, and good for society, and the evidence is overwhelming now. As Ug also said, we did quite a lot of work on trying to differentiate between what we slightly crassly call good density and bad density. This is a very simplistic binary way of thinking, I accept that, but it's very helpful because it allows us to observe, if you like, the lessons from the past and what we've learned about the ingredients of good density, and Ug has brilliantly demonstrated them in everything he said. And what was most important to us, I think, is to assert 2 points. One, it's possible to really delineate what is good density and what is bad density now. We know the ingredients, we know how to build good density, we know how to resist bad density, but even more important, and I think the La Défense case study shows this very well, is how to transition from a density that has some elements of bad density towards a density that has the elements of good density. In other words, density can be transformed into something that really works. And this is not just the experience of La Défense, it's also the experience in Brooklyn, it's the experience in Canary Wharf, it's the experience in Marina Bay in Singapore, it's the experience in Poblenou in Barcelona, it's the experience in many places. So we know about that now. We also looked at the role that density plays in different kinds of cities at different points in their trajectory, Judith. And one of the things that was really obvious to us was that in fast-growing cities like Istanbul and Stockholm and London, density plays a critical role in really adding capacity and adding adaptability as population growth and economic growth threatens to choke the city, as long as Leif said extremely clearly, there's political courage and leadership, particularly around infrastructure. In cities like Warsaw and Birmingham, where there's a sense of recovery and a restructuring going on, density can also play another role, a role of creating a new signature for the city, new centres, creating new amenities, providing a new kind of attractiveness in the context of wanting to be competitive. But in a city like Dresden, which is getting used to a new population base, which is lower than its historic peak, density also plays a role in consolidating activity around new, smaller cores, creating the opportunity to cluster amenities and assets in certain places so that you can rebuild again with a smaller city, but nonetheless enjoying the vibrancy and the dynamism that comes from density. And this was very important insight that different kinds of cities at different points in their evolutionary cycles can use density to achieve different kinds of goals. The psychology of density emerged as a really interesting element of the conversation, and Richard talked compellingly about this and the need, in a sense, to have a density which is acceptable, a density which is welcomed, a density which is people-oriented. We discovered in our conversations that there's several dimensions to this. Of course, there's the whole idea about creating places where people feel they belong, that sense of identity, that sense of participation. And Hugues was really just talking about that in relation to La Défense. But there's also the fact that different demographic groups have different kinds of appetites for urban lifestyles now, and that there are opportunities for districts to make very specific propositions, as it were, to different groups. And we look quite carefully at young people, older people, people in retirement. The densification of what we might call the elderly is a really interesting phenomena in our society these days, and the role that cities play in the welfare of people in the third age of life has become really key. Also, the role, for example, of urban education in improving the attractiveness of the city for parents with young children is a really interesting new phenomena, especially in Europe. So, if you like, there's different kinds of appeals of density for different people at stages in their own life cycles, as well as this very interesting conversation about identity, negotiation, the incremental approach. And then the last slide is this one. We tried to articulate a kind of new equation on density. What are the ingredients in any city that make it likely that progress with density will happen? Because let's be frank, there are more people who say that density is a good idea than there are cities that are actually building densely. Sprawl is still, in many senses, a kind of norm from which we're trying to reverse. So these 9 ingredients organized in 3 themes, getting the fundamentals of leadership and vision, plan and branding right, getting the execution right with tactics and scale and the financing, the legal and land use tools, and then getting momentum right with that positive psychology, the stimulation of demand, the multi-cycle approaches. What we were able to do, Judith, is identify this new equation on density, and then we looked at the cities that we studied, and we were able to score each of them in terms of how they perform on this equation. So it provides the initial basis for some benchmarking of cities. Which cities are ready for density, and which ones are not, and why. And it provides us with a very simple but I think helpful diagnostic tool to explain why some cities are and some cities are not progressing with density and what they might need to do better. Now, we did this with our 6 case study cities, and the people who hosted the workshops in those cities will remember these conversations. But I've also started applying this to cities in Africa and Latin America and India and elsewhere, and actually it proves to be a very useful tool for conversation about why a city is or is not promoting the density that it feels it needs.
Well, thank you very much, Greg. I think this new equation is something that both the public and the private sectors need to use in creating the cities for the future. So I'd like to thank all the panel for their contributions and now open it up to the audience. We have a few minutes left, so could it be short and sharp? Right. We start with here and then there.
I'd like to ask the question, what if there is no density? Like, we had a case study yesterday at our council day on Munich Airport and the development there. So how do you deal with a situation like that and incorporate density?
Right, who would like to deal with how do you actually begin, perhaps with a lack of political leadership where there isn't density and density isn't asked for by either side?
Well,
Greg?
2 points to make. I predict that over the next 50 years you'll see many more people living next to airports, because actually this idea that you can't live near to an airport is a very outmoded idea in our new world of quieter, cleaner aviation, and living near airports is going to become very popular. I don't know the specifics of the case of Munich, but clearly there's a challenge in Munich, which is one of Europe's most prosperous, most innovative cities. There is a challenge to build that metropolitan consensus about densification, about infrastructure investment, and about growth. Forgive me, people in the room who are from Munich, but they've had it so good for so long that they don't really want to change. And Munich's next 50 years is all about a slightly different story from the last 50 years, and they're really going to need to think about the long-term competitiveness story if Munich's going to work, because otherwise it's choking right now.
And perhaps the answer might be to do what La Défense has done. They needn't build an arch because that wouldn't be helpful near an airport, but they just bolt on. Yeah. Would you agree?
Well, the movement of population is, first of all, I strongly believe that the people more and more will split their daily calendar. So the problem of do they live far or close to their job is no more the question, in my opinion. The question is, in their generation, considering their activity, where do they feel that the gathering opportunities are the most important? If you create that close to their job, they will live there. If you create that outside, they will commute. And regarding the carbon footprint, it's much better to travel by public transportation, and we built a massive public transportation between La Défense and the center of Paris and the eastern part of Paris, and we're doubling it in the next 20 years. Is it the right track? Well, maybe it's even better when they don't go by public transportation and try to live where they feel that they can gather people and have the opportunities to meet, to create, to innovate. And so that's what we are trying to do just on the side of La Défense, because despite the fact that almost 90% are traveling by public transportation, which is a good thing, it's still 45 minutes for more than half of those 200,000 workers every day, one way, and 45 minutes other way. So we prefer to consider that we have to create something lively, modern, for the new generation, the newcomers, on the side of where they work instead of counting on the public transportation. So I think the best way to locate people and to build density near the places where they work is on the side of where they work. And that's completely different to Le Corbusier view, for example, who consider that you work in one place, you shop in another one, and you live in another one. Because of the split of the daily calendar, you cannot know in the morning if you will shop, work, or live. Keep for example, your children at home. But most important, shopping as for the new generation is absolutely no more the same thing. It's an experience. You work where you shop. So where's the frontier between working, living, entertaining, and consuming? I mean, that will be more and more difficult to separate these activities. So the best thing is to count on getting more close, where they live, where they shop, where they or consume, or where they work, to gather all that in a lively and creative space, which is no more a business space, but it's also no more a housing space.
So mixed use. So we have one behind and then Rosemary.
On the way here, I was reading a book from Kofi, that you have to live your life from your inside to the outside. And which is funny because we're talking about density, but I think, do you have an idea? Because the worst nightmare for a real estate developer is to use it. I mean, they ask all questions about how you're going to use it, and you're talking about identity. Do you have an idea how you can manage the identity of your future user in your density program?
I think that is a cultural process actually taking place. Let me explain to you with a simple example of Hafen City. When I started out, everyone told me no one will want to live in a harbor. Yeah? After 5 years, I was told by everyone no one wants to see its neighbor from the house. Yeah? After 8 years, I was told no family will want to live there. Yeah? And then I had constantly the issue of prices rising. So the cultural perspective of people is changing in terms of the cultural acceptance of density and the social benefit of having density. What we actually did was not simply building, for example, but naturally also providing a platform for interaction in terms of naturally the mixture of uses. Workspaces, 45,000 are developed in Hafen City, public spaces, and so on, but also to add a social dimension. Actually developing, so to say, not only housing cooperatives, but meeting points for people. Integrating a management system by the people themselves and the owners. For example, for meeting points and the activities themselves. So actually, what I was told then by a lot of the people was that they had learned to know in the first few months living in a new environment in Hafen City, more people than they had been knowing in their urban historical environment. And that can be done with an appropriate mix of activities, and that naturally also is part of the identity building of place, linking it to the understanding of the people. Naturally, some don't like it, some misread places, they move out, but there is a tremendous demand for people for those places where they can interact in the city, not only in functional and in business terms, but also in social terms. And if you provide a platform in urban development, not in urban building, but in urban development for that, that can be done successfully. And there are blueprints for doing that without being too rigid. If you involve, so to say, an interaction and encounter process as part of a urban development idea.
Yes, I just wanted to add something which is related to that. I'm talking about the case of a chosen density, which is a result of a choice, political choice. We didn't talk about one very important aspect. It's the public and the private spaces. To create something, to create a movement, to create social hubs, you have in the politics, among the government decision, and you have to create public spaces, because in their mind, and maybe in our mind, the gathering place, the gathering location are the public spaces. I don't believe it will be true in the next years. You create life when you privatize public spaces. In terms of people who are living there, have the feeling that they are living at home. And you have to open the private spaces so that private interest can answer the public needs, which is not the case of the government, even the local governments. So there will be a border between public and private spaces, which are the key point in giving life to a density. you will have a very flexible border, which is not the case yet, but I think the creation of a new density, a positive density, goes through this reflection.
That's a very important point. And final comment from Rosemary.
Thanks. It's the case studies, I think, prove, and Hafen City is a great case study, that the principles are generally accepted, that there is progress, there's acceptance of the requirement, even choice of millennials and re-urbanizing older people. But of your 9 boxes there, Greg, is it the land use tools that are moving so slowly that we won't be able to keep up actually with the momentum that is there in the market and even choice of people? And if so, what do we do about that?
Excellent question.
So that box in execution, the financing, legal and land use tools, is the biggest barrier in most European cities. It's not the big barrier in Asian cities, where the barriers are much more about vision and quality and infrastructure. And actually in North American cities, it's more about the planning and the branding. So in Europe, that's the big challenge. And of course, it's much less of a challenge in Germany, Switzerland than it is, let's say, in Scandinavia, the UK, France, Spain, Italy, for all the reasons that everybody understands. So those are the big barriers, and processes of reform, but also bravery. I think, Leif made this point that many cities have tools and powers they are afraid to use because they perceive them to be politically unpopular. Compulsory purchase or sequestration powers in order to assemble sites, for example, powers to levy taxes or increments or assessments to finance infrastructure. These things are politically perceived to be unpopular, and this acts as a disincentive to leadership. So it's partly having the tools, it's partly being willing to use them as well.
And it's also looking at what is obsolete, because some of the planning tools, which were designed to deal with a very different population density, are now no longer appropriate. And yet planners hold on to them because they think they represent ultimate quality, but it's not the new quality.
That's a big issue, actually.
And it's a huge issue.
Yeah.
I mean, if you just take rights to light in the UK, it's holding up an enormous number of stunning developments.
Well,
and yet, the planners sit there and thinking, we're looking after the quality of life of our people, but they're not. They're thinking 50 years ago. So we, all of us who are operating in this area, have to chip away at those outdated views. And that goes for all cities in Europe.
May I add one small point very quickly? I mean, Michael Spies said to us right at the beginning of this project, remember in a sense that democracy is the problem, right? And Michael explained that much more eloquently than I just have. But Michael reminded us that, the problem with democracy is that it franchises the current residents against future residents, people who might come in, the people you might have in the future. And the problem with that is that local government then becomes captured by the short-term interests of the current resident asset-owning class. And that's no way to densify a city. So what we discover a lot is the sanctification of historic land uses as if they were some kind of doctrinal given that certain land must be used for one purpose rather than another. So flexibility is really key, and somehow stepping out of the short-termism of democracy is really important.
And can I say a huge thank you to the panel.